Guardians. Today we're covering the top 5 builds that every hunter needs in their arsenal. These builds all have their own specialty. Some will offer you upwards of 90% damage resistance, insane ad clearing potential by causing ignitions, jolting targets, and shattering crystals. But one thing they all bring you is pure satisfaction. So, rally your fellow Guardians, prepare your arsenal, and join us as we unveil the top 5 builds that every hunter needs in Destiny 2. Remember to leave a like if you find this video helpful, and if you like seeing build videos and other Destiny 2 helpful content, consider hitting that subscribe button. With that being said, let's jump right on into it. And first up on my list is a prismatic build that gives you a ton of damage resistance at a moment's notice. With the new Gifted Conviction exotic chest piece, you now create 3 tracking projectiles whenever you activate Ascension. While this added damage is cool, we mainly take it for the other half of this exotic, where you gain stacking damage resistance for jolting enemies that are close to you. This means that for this season, we can activate Ascension and go Amplified, gaining 30% damage resistance, and jolt targets to gain up to 4 stacks of resistance, which equates to about 50% damage resistance. Usually I get about 2 stacks per activation, so this means by pressing one button, we have an extra 47.5% damage resistance. Plus, we can bring weapons with Volt Shot to not only gain more AoE damage, but also add another way to jolt targets, to easily gain up to 4 stacks, giving you 65% damage resistance on a regular basis. With just these 2 pieces alone, we gain even more damage resistance with Faceted Protection, maxing out our resilience, resistance mods, and transcendence to give you upwards of 87.96 resistance. We then bring Facet of Purpose and Golden Gun as our super, so that when we pick up an orb, we gain restoration to have constant healing. We also have high ability uptime by bringing Facet of Awakening to create a ton of Ionic Traces, and Facet of Hope to gain back our class ability a bit quicker. And since we want to use our Ascension so often, that requires our class ability. So we bring Winter Shroud to get an extra 300% increased class ability regeneration whenever we slow targets. So we bring the Duskfield Grenade or a Chill Clip weapon to have a way to slow targets. And what's the flow for this build? Well, it's pretty simple. Run up to a group of enemies and pop your Ascension to gain immediate damage resistance and deal decent damage to them. Immediately throw your Duskfield Grenade or use your Chill Clip weapon to rapidly gain back class ability energy. Then consistently use your Volt Shot weapon to wipe out mass amounts of targets, all while keeping up your damage resistance. When it comes to stats, I shoot for 100 in resilience and discipline, and then I aim for about 70 to 80 in both mobility and strength. As for weapons, I really like the non-denouement, which is an arc bow that honestly feels like a legendary version of Trinity Ghoul. We can get a roll with Strategist for more class ability energy, and Volt Shot for more damage and that damage resistance. Or you can take something like the new Sightline Survey, which is a hand cannon from this season that can also get that same exact roll. As for the artifact, we have a couple perks that we do want to bring. Radiant Orbs gives you 25% weapon damage whenever you pick up an orb. You can also take Galvanic Armor, so you can get that 30% damage resistance every time you pop your Ascension. We also then bring Shield Crush to give you back more grenade energy and damage by consistently staying amplified and radiant. And I also like to take Transference, so that we can get weapon kills while Transcendent to gain back even more Transcendent energy. With this build, you can continuously pop your Ascension to deal damage and gain immaculate damage resistance, and not to mention fly around like a helicopter. With the amount of damage resistance you get with this build, it stacks up in even the hardest content when you play it right. And listen, I know everyone hates Combination Blow on hunters, but the fact of the matter is, it's really strong, which is why it's showing up on our next build. With class exotics giving you benefits from 2 different exotics, we can amp up our builds to extreme levels, and for this build, we're looking at a class item with Spirits of Caliban and Lyre. Previously, I mentioned Synthoceps instead of Spirit of the Lyre, and while that can work to give you extra damage, when paired with Combination Blow, it only equates to about an added 30% damage, so I've switched it to Spirit of the Lyre. Now you can create ignitions on every melee kill, and that becomes a whole lot easier by giving you an extra 200% increased damage on every other melee. So we bring Facet of Ruin so that these ignitions have a larger area of effect, and if we can shatter a target, they'll take even more damage and have a larger area of effect. You can then bring Facet of Bravery so that you gain unraveling rounds for your strand weapons by getting melee kills, and then Facet of Protection for extra damage resistance when you're surrounded. Top it all off with Facet of Blessing so that you can can start health regen on every melee kill. And what's the flow for this build? Well, it's very simple. Use your dodge and your melee to cycle back and forth between combination blow and your dodge. The whole time you'll be causing ignitions, going invisible, and shattering targets. It really is that easy. Your class exotic really does all the work for you. As for the stats, I shoot for 100 resilience and discipline. Any leftover stats can go into intellect. Mobility and strength are pretty much irrelevant by how often you go invisible, and recovery really isn't needed. As for the weapons, since most of the mid-game rotation is just meleeing and dodging, you can really bring any weapons that fit the activity you're in. For the artifact, we bring radiant orbs so that we can gain radiant and that 25% weapon damage whenever we pick up an orb. And we also take galvanic armor so that we get that 30% damage resistance just by using our melee a few times. And top it all off with shield crush so that we consistently have 25% more grenade recharge rate and 20% more damage. This build, it is an immensely more powerful version of the well-known Arc Hunter build. You can cause ignitions everywhere by dealing a ton of damage to any target and consistently go invisible, making it super strong for any level activity. When running hard content, having ways to heal and take less damage is great, but sometimes you just need a way to take absolutely no damage. And that's where a build like this next one comes in. We bring the exotic Omnioculus to gain an extra smoke bomb, giving us and our team 50% damage resistance while we're invisible, which is why we bring Trapper's Ambush, so that we can activate Quickfall while in the air to dive back down, making us and any nearby teammates invisible. The beautiful thing is that we can now go invisible more often and gain that damage resistance, but it also allows you to refund your melee charge based on how many teammates you make invisible. See, in a normal strike or nightfall, you have 2 other teammates to work with. Well, each teammate that you make invisible will give you 50% of your melee energy. So if you do the math, that means you'll get back your melee charge just by making both your teammates invisible. Add in the fact that we have 2 melee charges to work with and Vanishing Step, we now have 4 ways to go invisible, and that doesn't even account for the incredible melee regen that we get. So we bring fragments like Echo of Persistence to stay invisible longer, Echo of Starvation to gain Devour on orb pickup so that we can get more health on kills, and Echo of Vigilance so that when we get a kill while at low health, we gain a Void Overshield. So the flow for this build goes like this. Use your weapons and grenade on a normal basis to clear out enemies. Whenever you get low on health, activate your Quickfall to gain that damage resistance and go invisible. If you can do this on a teammate, you'll have a very high uptime on your melee, and if not, simply dodge near an enemy while invisible to gain back a melee charge and stay invisible longer. When it comes to stats, I shoot for 100 in resilience and discipline, and then I like to go for about 70 in strength. When it comes to weapons, because this build is all about staying alive with your abilities, you can bring whatever weapons that match the activity you're in. So if you're in an activity like the Glassway that's the GM for last week, you can bring something like Outbreak to shoot through those Hydra shields. As for the artifact, since we're on a Void subclass, the main ones we want to take are Void Hegemony, so that we gain a Void Overshield by killing a weakened enemy, and Expanding Abyss, so that Void damage deals increased damage to weakened targets. And where does this build excel? Well, this build is a very strong build when it comes to hard activities, since it provides so much invisibility and damage resistance. It can be used in lower end content, though I think there are plenty of other better options out there for easier content. Sometimes we as players get tied up in trying to do the hardest content and output the most amount of damage possible, and we forget that this is a video game. We're meant to have fun. So that's why I put together this next build. While it does have good synergies and could be argued as being a strong build, I just have so much fun running it. We bring the exotic gauntlets, Mothkeeper's Wraps, which replaces our grenade with a moth cage that will spawn 2 moths, and depending on the closest target, it changes what kind of moth that is. When thrown near enemies, an arc moth spawns that deals damage and blinds targets. When thrown near allies, a void moth will spawn and gives the closest ally a void overshield. These moths actually deal a decent amount of damage, but we amp it up even further by bringing Facet of Dominance to have our moths also jolt targets. We then bring facets of Awakening, Balance, and Courage to gain back more ability energy and deal more damage with light abilities on enemies affected by a darkness debuff. So we then bring Winter Shroud to slow enemies by dodging near them, and Threaded Spectre to create decoys by dodging. And since I like this as my fun build, I'm bringing Threaded Spike as the melee so that we can wipe out a ton of enemies and catch that spike as it comes back to us and regain a bunch of melee energy in the process. So what's the gameplay loop? Well, just have fun. We can cause chaos by throwing a ton of moths, creating a ton of decoys to distract enemies and spawn threadlings, or even use our Threaded Spike to wipe out a group of enemies. When it comes to improving the build, I shoot for about 100 resilience, 100 discipline, and about 70 in strength. I aim to create as many moths as possible, so that 100 discipline, it's really nice. As for the weapons, you can bring something like Buried Bloodline to gain Devour, and in turn more grenade energy. But a really fun and interesting combo is the X-Deer Iris. Now, getting kills with this weapon will create an arc and a void moth. While it's not the best weapon, it will give you void overshields and make you amplified so that you take less damage. As for the artifact, we mainly want to bring radiant orbs to get that 25% weapon damage whenever we pick up an orb, and the 30% damage resistance by getting arc kills that mainly comes from our moths. So where does this build excel? Well, this build excels at bringing some joy into your life. It feels so different from the meta right now, and honestly, it's just a ton of fun to use, so definitely give it a shot. And I've always loved the idea of stasis, and in the past it hasn't really felt the strongest, but with the changes and the new build combos, I gotta say, I'm loving this next build. I really wanted to make this build on the stasis subclass, but there's one main reason why I landed on Prismatic: Ascension. See, with Ascension, you can activate helicopter mode to shatter any nearby targets and crystals. This specific interaction is so cool and pretty strong. Now you can throw a Duskfield grenade to freeze targets, bring a weapon with headstone to create crystals, or even bring the Salvation's Grip to create a ton of crystals and then immediately shatter all of them by activating Ascension. If you have a tougher target like a boss or a mini boss, you'll even jolt them for even more damage. So we bring Facet of Ruin to increase the size and damage from that shatter damage that we're causing. And I have a roll on the exotic class item with Spirits of Renewal and Coyote so that I can gain damage resistance by standing in my Duskfield grenade while I wait for those enemies to freeze. And I can get an extra class ability charge so that I can activate Ascension more often to shatter more targets. I then bring Winter Shroud to gain an extra 300% class ability regen by slowing targets. This allows you to have a ton more uptime on your Ascension, meaning that you can shatter and cause more jolting overall. So the gameplay loop goes like this: throw a Duskfield grenade to start freezing enemies, then run in it to gain stacks of frost armor, and once the enemies are frozen, pop your Ascension to shatter those targets. If you have a boss that you can get close to, I like to throw a Duskfield grenade at his feet to gain that damage resistance from frost armor. Then I pop my super to start freezing and insta shattering. Then I cycle between creating crystals from Salvation's Grip and using Ascension to cause jolt, deal more damage, and stay amplified. While it's not the most practical in endgame activities, it's a ton of fun to do on bosses in low and mid game activities. So for stats, I shoot for 100 resilience, 100 discipline, and about 70 strength. I like to bring a stasis weapon with headstone so that I can cause more shatter damage and more slowing from the artifact. But you can also bring something like the Indebted Kindness with Volt Shot to stay amplified at range and cause more AoE damage. As for the artifact, we bring Creeping Chill so that stasis weapon kills on slowed or frozen targets create a slowing burst. And then we also bring Radiant Orbs to become radiant and gain that 25% weapon damage by picking up an orb, as well as Galvanic Armor to gain 30% damage resistance whenever we're amplified, which is all the time when we're using Ascension. And then finally, we take Shield Crush to gain increased grenade recharge and melee recharge when we have our elemental buffs active, which is pretty much all the time as well. And where does this build excel? Well, with the shatter damage that you can cause paired with the damage resistance that you can get means this build can actually hold its own in most content. I think it excels the most when there are a ton of enemies to deal with, like in a game mode like Onslaught. And there is one bonus build that I have to mention. The double Golden Gun Still Hunt build is an insanely powerful build, but we have mentioned it 2 other times on the channel. So if you want to see more on this insane boss DPS build, go check out one of these 2 videos. And there you have it, Guardians. We've covered builds that excel at clearing out a ton of enemies, builds that are just pure fun, and even builds that keep you hidden like a ninja. Remember, mastering these builds is only the beginning. Experiment with different combinations, tweak your loadouts to suit your playstyle, and never stop honing your skills. If you found this video helpful or just enjoyed seeing a new perspective, feel free to like the video and comment down below what builds you've been enjoying the most for Hunters. Keep an eye out for future videos as we continue to explore the ever-evolving world of Destiny 2. Until then, may the threads of fate be ever in your favor. This is Lucky Mech signing off. See you on the next adventure, Guardians.